Since the earliest days of nuclear energy, the fear of catastrophic accidents has loomed over both scientists and the public alike. The threat of reactor meltdowns and invisible radiation has followed the atomic age like a shadow. Disasters such as Chernobyl and Fukushima have become synonymous with nuclear power, permanently reshaping public perception of the technology. But before these names entered the global consciousness, the world's first nuclear reactor meltdown occurred at a little-known facility in Canada. In December of 1952, the Chalk River Laboratories suffered a devastating accident that would forever change nuclear safety standards. Just 6 years later, the same site would experience another serious nuclear incident. The history of the Chalk River facility began in the midst of the Second World War. As the race to develop the atomic bomb intensified, Canada formed a scientific alliance with Britain and the United States to support their nuclear research. Early work was carried out at the University of Montreal, where the project focused on two main objectives. The first was to construct a functioning nuclear reactor capable of producing sustained energy, and the second was to produce plutonium, a key material required for nuclear weapons that would support the Allied war effort. To achieve these goals, plans were developed to build the NRX, or National Research Experimental Reactor, along with a plutonium extraction plant. A remote location was needed for safety and security reasons. Ultimately, a site roughly 180 kilometers north of Ottawa was selected. This area, known as Chalk River, would soon become the center of Canada's nuclear research efforts. Then, on July 16, 1945, in the deserts of New Mexico, a device nicknamed Gadget was detonated during what became known as the Trinity test. With an explosive yield of roughly 26 kilotons, the world officially entered the nuclear age. And just 3 weeks later, at approximately 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, the bomber Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb known as Little Boy over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. And 3 days later, at 11:02 on August 9th, the second bomb, Fat Man, was detonated over Nagasaki, marking the last time nuclear weapons would be deployed in a conflict. Less than a month later, on September 5th, 1945, a quiet but historic event took place at Chalk River in Canada. An experimental nuclear reactor, known as Zero Energy Experimental Pile, or ZEEP, was switched on for the first time, producing only a single watt of power. Its output was modest, but the significance was enormous. The ZEEP became the first nuclear reactor outside of the United States to achieve a sustained nuclear chain reaction. Officially, the Chalk River site was presented to the public as a purely scientific research facility. Yet behind its red brick walls and sunlit windows, the NRX reactor was being developed, and in 1947, it would come online, generating more than 20 megawatts of energy and placing Canada at the forefront of nuclear research. At the heart of the facility stood the reactor itself, a sealed aluminium vessel or calandria, resembling a towering silo. Measuring approximately 2.6 meters or 9 feet in height, and about 3 meters or 10 feet in diameter. Inside the container were 175 vertical tubes arranged in a precise ladder structure. Of these, 163 held uranium fuel rods, while the remaining 12 were control rods coated in boron carbide. These control rods played a critical role in regulating the nuclear reaction. By inserting them deeper into the core, neutron collisions were absorbed, slowing or even halting the reaction entirely. Pulling them out allowed more collisions to occur, increasing the reactor's output. There's also another key part. The reactor also relied on heavy water containing deuterium, an isotope of hydrogen, to moderate the reaction. By slowing down neutrons, heavy water made it more likely to trigger further fission events, intensifying the process. Reducing the volume of heavy water could in turn slow the reaction. Meanwhile, ordinary water circulated through pipes around the reactor to act as coolant, carrying away excessive heat. Much of the work done at the Chalk River facility was carried out using remote-controlled robotic equipment, designed to minimize human exposure to radiation. However, whenever workers were required to handle radioactive material directly, their health was closely monitored by medical professionals. Safety protocols were extensive and uncompromising. In employee areas, walls were regularly stripped back and repainted to prevent the accumulation of radioactive particles. In extreme cases, entire buildings were dismantled and rebuilt using clean materials once contamination levels became too high. On December 12, 1952, the Chalk River Nuclear Reactor was undergoing a routine test that required its output to be significantly reduced. It was the final test of the day, scheduled for around 3 p.m., and involved removing much of the reactor's cooling water. This reduction limited the reactor's ability to dissipate heat, making careful control essential. Then, during the procedure, an operator in the control room examined the compressed air system connected to the reactor's control rods. Believing the readings were incorrect, he responded by raising 4 control rods out of the reactor core. With less cooling water present, this action caused the power levels and temperature inside the reactor to rise rapidly. Immediately, warning systems activated, filling the control room with red flashing lights. And at 3:07, a supervisor called the control room and instructed the operator to press buttons 3 and 4. Button 3 would lock the control rods in place, while button 4 would lower all control rods simultaneously, shutting down the nuclear reaction and stabilizing the reactor. However, in a critical moment of miscommunication, the supervisor mistakenly said buttons 1 and 4. Before the error could be corrected, the operator pressed button 1. This action withdrew all control rods from the reactor core at once, dramatically accelerating the nuclear reaction instead of stopping it. Although the supervisor quickly realized his mistake and attempted to correct the instruction, the damage had already been done. The reactor's power output surged far beyond the normal maximum of 30 megawatts, briefly reaching approximately 100 megawatts. As the temperature inside the calandria continued to rise and the uranium fuel rods began to melt, a dangerous chemical reaction took place. The extreme heat caused the water and metal to produce hydrogen gas. When the hydrogen gas came into contact with oxygen in the air, it ignited, triggering an explosion that tore through the aluminium walls of the calandria. The blast ruptured the cooling system, releasing approximately 4.5 million litres of radioactive water into the basement of the facility. The contained water spread radiation throughout the lower levels of the reactor building. Historian Wilfred Eggleston later noted that the radioactive content of the floodwater was several times greater than the total global production of radium at the time, underscoring the scale of contamination. As the water poured through the building, radiation levels in the air surged. Initially, readings reached 200 millirems per hour. To put this into perspective, the average North American receives approximately 630 millirems of radiation over an entire year. Just minutes later, at 3:11, levels climbed to over 900 millirems per hour. Within 16 minutes, the measurement exceeded 5,000 millirems per hour. Sirens began to echo across the facility as workers realized the severity of the situation, and construction foreman Al Donahue, who was nearby overseeing work of the new reactor, immediately evacuated his crew, later recalling that the radiation seemed to hang in the air itself. Adding to the danger, a strong westerly wind carried radioactive particles from the damaged NRX reactor towards nearby buildings. Many of them soon recorded off-the-scale radiation readings. Then, at 3:47, less than an hour after the initial mistake, a plant-wide evacuation was ordered. In the days that followed, officials attempted to reassure the public. Journalists from the Ottawa Citizen were invited to tour the site, where authorities downplayed the dangers, claiming radiation fears were exaggerated, and the conditions were no more dangerous than crossing a city street. Privately, however, leaders of the AECL were fully aware of the scale of contamination. The damaged reactor building was highly radioactive and required immediate and extensive cleanup. Decontamination efforts began almost at once and would ultimately stretch for 14 months. The involvement of the United States was not accidental. At the time, the US Navy was at the early stages of developing nuclear-powered submarines, and their fuel was being tested at Chalk River. Restoring the NRX reactor as quickly as possible was therefore a strategic priority for both nations, with one of the most urgent challenges being removing the roughly 4.5 million litres of contaminated water that have flooded the basement of the reactor building. Dumping the water into the nearby Ottawa River was not an option, as it would spread the contamination downstream. Instead, engineers devised an improvised solution. They constructed a pipeline that carried the contaminated water approximately 1,600 metres away from the site to a large sandy area. There, the sand acted as a natural filtration system, absorbing and partially cleaning the radioactive material as the water slowly seeped downwards. From there, it flowed into a nearby creek and would eventually flow into a lake. Continuous monitoring followed the operation closely. Surprisingly, radiation measurements taken after the drainage process showed little to no levels of above normal background readings in the surrounding waterways. The solution appeared to have worked, preventing further environmental contamination and allowing for the lengthy cleanup process to continue. Following the extensive cleanup after the 1952 accident, the AECL brought the Chalk River facility back into operation. In 1957, a new, far more powerful reactor, the National Research Universal, or NRU, began operating in a nearby building. Designed to be one of the most advanced research reactors in the world, the NRU was capable of generating up to 200 megawatts of thermal power. Then, on May 24, 1958, the NRU was temporarily shut down so damaged uranium fuel rods could be removed from the reactor core. The procedure required a crane operator to extract each rod, place it into a special water-filled cooling flask, and then transfer the flask into a storage pool where the rods could safely cool. Midway through the operation, however, a worker noticed a critical mistake. One of the uranium fuel rods had been placed into a flask that contained no water at all. Without cooling, the rod was immediately at risk of overheating. The only option was to quickly return it to the reactor. The crane operator attempted to reinsert the rod, but it became jammed halfway into the core. And then when he tried to pull it free to reposition it, the rod snapped. Instantly, the exposed uranium ignited. Burning fragments were thrown into the air, filling the reactor room with radioactive dust and fumes that soon spread throughout the NRU building. Most employees were evacuated immediately. However, a small group of volunteers remained behind to extinguish the fire. Among them was the construction foreman Al Donahue, who also played a key role during the 1952 accident. After helping evacuate his crew, Donahue returned with bins of sand to smother the burning uranium. In a remarkable scene, staff from across the facility, including office workers from the accounts department, took turns running across the narrow catwalk above the reactor core, dumping buckets of sand into the flames. To limit radiation exposure, each volunteer worked in 2-minute shifts. Within 15 minutes, the fire was finally extinguished, but the danger was far from over. Radioactive dust and debris now coated the reactor room, requiring a massive cleanup effort. A metallurgist on site volunteered for the task, entering the darkened reactor hall in protective gear and using a large vacuum hose to collect glowing radioactive pellets. Hundreds of AECL employees participated in the operation until they had reached their maximum radiation limit. Once those limits were exceeded, the Canadian military was brought in, deploying roughly 300 troops to continue the cleanup. Although both Chalk River accidents were serious, neither resulted in immediate deaths. Yet the true danger of radiation exposure often emerges slowly, with illnesses developing years or decades later. As concerns grew over the long-term health consequences, former servicemen and scientists began pushing for recognition and accountability. In 1979, a former Canadian soldier named Bjarne Hannibal Paulson reached out to Gordon Edwards, co-founder of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. Paulson had been among the 300 troops sent in to assist with the 1958 cleanup operation. His specific job involved cutting the hose of the industrial vacuum used to collect the radioactive uranium pellets scattered throughout the reactor building. Years after the accident, Paulson developed skin cancer, a disease commonly linked to radiation exposure, and sought Edwards' help in pursuing the compensation for the damage he believed that was caused by his service. Edwards soon partnered with Professor Duncan Thomas from McGill University to investigate the long-term health of the cleanup crews involved in the 1958 incident. That same year, Canada's Department of Veterans Affairs commissioned a broader study by the University of Ottawa. This larger investigation examined military personnel exposed during both the 1952 and 1958 Chalk River accidents, along with individuals involved in nuclear weapons testing. The Ottawa study followed 434 exposed servicemen between 1953 and 1981. During that period, 10 died from cancer, a mortality rate of 2.3%. By comparison, a control group of 954 unexposed military personnel recorded a slightly higher cancer mortality rate of 2.5%. On the surface, these results suggested no increased risk among those exposed at Chalk River. However, the researchers acknowledged major limitations. Some exposure records had been destroyed in a fire, meaning not all affected workers were included. More importantly, the study focused only on deaths and ignored morbidity, meaning those who developed cancer but survived, or those who still had cancer, were not counted. In contrast, a McGill study of 65 cleanup workers found that 15 later developed cancer, a rate roughly 4 times higher than expected. This pointed towards significant long-term health effects. After years of legal battles, Paulson eventually received compensation, And in 2008, the Canadian government launched the Atomic Veterans Recognitions Program to compensate military personnel involved in nuclear cleanup efforts. Civilian workers, however, were initially excluded. Former employees like Al Donahue and George Keeley later led a campaign to secure recognition for civilian volunteers. Their persistence finally paid off in 2022, with the launch of the Atomic Workers Recognition Program, extending compensation to former AECL workers and their families. The Chalk River accidents may not have been the most infamous nuclear disaster. I'm sure you can think of two just off the top of your head, but their impact was no less profound. They revealed how fragile early nuclear technology truly was, and how a single mistake could unleash forces beyond human control. And more importantly, they left a long-lasting toll on the men who risked their lives to contain the disaster, many of whom suffered in silence for decades. While history often remembers explosions and immediate disasters, it is the long, invisible consequences of radiation that linger the longest. Chalk River stands as a reminder that the progress in the nuclear age came at a human cost, one that would take generations to fully acknowledge. Thank you for watching.